The golden gates of Buckingham Palace are rattling, and for once, it's not because of a rowdy tourist group or a malfunctioning royal guard's bearskin hat. No, this time, the seismic shockwave is coming from the very top of the food chain. Imagine waking up to an announcement that stops the entire Commonwealth dead in its tracks. Prince William did not arrive alone at the high-security briefing room today. Standing right beside him, looking colder than a British winter and twice as sharp, was Princess Anne. Her expression? Absolute fury. Her hands? Held perfectly still, like a hunter tracking its prey. Then came the words that sent a literal shiver down the spine of every courtier in London. Prince Louis is being indefinitely removed from all major public royal appearances. Let that sink in. The internet's favorite chaotic, balcony dancing, face-making young prince is being hidden away behind closed doors.
But why?
Was it just a harmless security glitch? Or are we looking at something far more sinister? A dark, internal betrayal that reaches the absolute core of the British monarchy? Before we blow the lid off this massive cover-up and reveal exactly why William and Anne are ready to tear down the palace walls to protect this child, you need to do one thing. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because the truths we are exposing today will not be found on the mainstream news. Are you ready for the real story? Let's dive deep into the cold, hard reality. The briefing room grew impossibly quiet as the heavy oak doors clicked shut behind the Prince of Wales and the Princess Royal. William did not offer the customary nod to the assembled intelligence chiefs or the senior household administrators waiting around the mahogany table. The traditional polite corporate diplomacy that usually governs the upper echelons of the British state had been entirely discarded. On any regular Tuesday, this room would be filled with the rustle of briefing papers, the soft clinking of porcelain teacups bearing the royal cipher, and the practiced, whispered sycophancy of career courtiers trying to secure their next promotion. Today, there was only the sound of William's palms hitting the polished wood as he leaned forward, forcing every single bureaucrat in the room to look directly into the eyes of a completely furious father. Beside him, Princess Anne adjusted the cuffs of her dark jacket with a terrifying, calculated precision. She did not need to raise her voice to command absolute terror. Her reputation as the most industrious, no-nonsense operative within the House of Windsor preceded her. For decades, she had been the institutional memory of this family, the one who buried the scandals, enforced the discipline, and kept the machinery running while everyone else was busy generating headlines. But today, her legendary loyalty to the institution had clearly pivoted toward an entirely different, far more aggressive objective. She was not here to protect the crown from a scandal. She was here to protect her grandnephew from the very people paid to watch the doors. The immediate announcement that Prince Louis was being pulled from the public eye had already sent shockwaves through the global media apparatus, but the official press release was nothing more than a highly sanitized, beautifully written lie designed to keep the public from panicking. The public was told that the young prince was simply taking a scheduled break from the overwhelming demands of royal ceremonial life, a perfectly reasonable explanation for a spirited child who had captured the world's affection with his unscripted balcony antics. The mainstream news networks were already running pre-packaged segments about the challenges of raising royal children under the relentless glare of the modern media lens, invoking past historical precedents to make the decisions seem routine, protective, and thoroughly mundane. But the truth waiting inside this secure room was far colder and significantly more damaging to the structural integrity of the monarchy. The terrifying security breach that had shaken the Wales household to its absolute core had not occurred in the chaotic, unpredictable environment of a crowded public walkabout. It had not been perpetrated by a lone, obsessive fan slipping past a barrier during a chaotic parade, nor had it been the result of an unforeseen logistical failure during a high-profile tour. It had happened deep within the inner sanctum of a heavily fortified, restricted royal estate, a place where every single square inch is theoretically monitored by state-of-the-art surveillance, armed guards, and layers of background-checked personnel. William looked down at the confidential incident report resting between his hands, his fingers tightening against the paper until the edges began to tear. The documents detailed an unauthorized breach of an internal corridor, a specific threshold that required a top-tier administrative security clearance to access. This wasn't a case of a broken lock or a perimeter fence being scaled in the dead of night. An electronic security gate, programmed to recognize only the digital credentials of trusted palace staff, had been opened from the inside, allowing an unidentified individual to navigate the private residential pathways with an alarming degree of familiarity and ease. The intruder had bypassed 3 separate security checkpoints without triggering a single alarm, moving through the historic stone hallways with the confidence of someone who possessed an intimate, up-to-the-minute knowledge of the family's private schedule and layout. When the individual finally encountered Prince Louis, who had momentarily stepped away from his protective detail in a supposedly secure family zone, the interaction was not a random act of trespassing. It was a calculated, direct approach. The stranger had knelt down, addressing the young royal by a highly guarded, private family nickname that is never used in public broadcasts or official correspondence, before delivering a chilling, 5-word message that had left the young prince frozen in absolute terror. And watched the senior officials absorb the specific technical details of the breach, her sharp gaze scanning the room for any sign of administrative deflection or rehearsed excuse-making. She knew exactly how the palace machinery operated when a catastrophic failure occurred. The standard operating procedure was always to blame a systemic glitch, a technical malfunction, or an unfortunate gap in communication between competing security agencies. For generations, the household had successfully hidden institutional negligence behind a wall of polite bureaucracy, sacrificing junior staff members or low-level contractors to protect the reputations of the powerful directors who managed the various royal departments. But as the lead security officer opened his mouth to offer a carefully worded apology regarding operational oversight and cut him off with a single, devastatingly quiet remark that made the entire room freeze. She reminded the room that a digital lock does not experience a lapse in judgment, and an internal security log does not spontaneously erase its own data entries without human intervention. Someone with immense administrative authority had consciously bypassed the protocols, someone within the inner circle had deliberately cleared the path, and someone inside this very institution had failed the most vulnerable member of the royal house. The weight of this institutional betrayal was already manifesting as a profound human crisis within the private walls of Adelaide Cottage, completely dismantling the carefully constructed facade of normal family life that William and Catherine had fought so hard to maintain for their 3 children. For years, the Prince and Princess of Wales had operated under a strict, unyielding philosophy when it came to their offspring, attempting to provide them with a grounded, balanced upbringing that shielded them from the historic burdens of their royal destinies. They wanted their children to experience real play, genuine friendships, and a sense of absolute security within their own home, understanding that the psychological scars of an overexposed childhood can linger for a lifetime. William knew this painful reality better than anyone else alive. His own early years had been thoroughly defined by the flashing bulbs of intrusive cameras, the cold scrutiny of international tabloid commentary, and the constant, suffocating feeling of being treated as a historical artifact rather than a human being. He had promised himself, and he had promised his wife, that his own children would never be forced to perform for the cameras when they were hurting, that their emotional well-being would always take precedence over the demands of the state. Yet, the terrifying reality of the breach had completely shattered that domestic sanctuary, transforming their private residence from a place of uninhibited safety into an environment filled with invisible, terrifying threats. The young prince, who had spent his entire life being celebrated for his boisterous, completely fearless personality, had suddenly become hyper-vigilant, his natural confidence replaced by a devastating, quiet anxiety that broke his parents' hearts. He no longer dashed through the corridors of his home with the joyful abandon of a carefree child. Instead, he lingered at the thresholds of familiar rooms, his small fingers gripping his mother's hand with a frantic, desperate intensity. He would look up at Catherine, his eyes wide with a profound confusion that no 7-year-old should ever have to process, and ask if the locks had been verified, if the people waiting inside were genuinely supposed to be there, and if the stranger from the corridor was still hiding somewhere in the shadows. Catherine would kneel down on the hard floor, burying her own rising panic beneath a practiced smile of maternal reassurance, whispering promises of safety into her son's ear, while fighting back the tears that threatened to compromise her composure. The structural damage to the family dynamic extended far beyond Louis's immediate psychological trauma, creating a deep, agonizing rift of guilt and anger that threatened to destabilize the entire household's internal operations. Catherine carried an unbearable, silent burden of self-reproach, constantly replaying the events of that fateful afternoon in her mind, wondering how she could have allowed her youngest son to slip even a few paces behind her in a corridor she had been assured was completely secure. She had trusted the professional assurances of the senior protection officers, individuals who had spent their entire lives managing international threat matrices, believing that the internal perimeter of a royal estate was the one place on Earth where her children could simply exist without constant, stifling surveillance. Now, every single past decision she had made regarding their public schedule, every engagement she had approved, and every compromise she had accepted for the sake of royal tradition felt like a dangerous gamble that had ultimately backfired against her own flesh and blood. William's reaction to the crisis was characterized by a cold, increasingly dangerous anger that left no room for administrative compromise or polite negotiation with the palace staff. Every single time a senior courtier or an intelligence advisor attempted to minimize the incident by labeling it a temporary operational anomaly or a minor procedural lapse, William's composure would visibly fray. An operational anomaly could be solved with a revised spreadsheet, a new training seminar, or a slightly updated security manual, but the profound psychological damage inflicted upon his youngest child could not be erased by an administrative rewrite. His son was now actively scanning the faces of the household staff, listening intently for the sound of unfamiliar footsteps outside his bedroom door at night, and hesitating before entering spaces that had once been his absolute sanctuary. The future king was quickly realizing that the very institution he was destined to inherit was trying to treat his family's trauma as a minor public relations issue to be managed, rather than a catastrophic failure of basic human protection. The tension escalated dramatically when Princess Anne revealed the existence of a highly confidential, privately recorded audio file containing an off-the-record interview with the lead security coordinator on duty during the breach. During this tense, highly sensitive exchange, it became horrifyingly apparent that the young prince had provided a remarkably clear, highly specific description of the intruder's physical appearance and distinctive uniform markings immediately after the encounter. Crucially, the child had also repeated the exact phrase the man had spoken to him, a detail that should have immediately triggered an intensive, internal manhunt across every single department operating within the Windsor estate. Yet, when Anne compared the raw, initial interview notes with a finalized, polished incident summary presented to the king's desk, she discovered that every single specific detail provided by the child had been deliberately omitted from the official record. The specific phrase had been scrubbed, the description of the uniform had been generalized into insignificance, and the entire interaction had been framed as a case of childish imagination and hyperactive confusion, and had immediately summoned the high-ranking security official responsible for signing off on that finalized, altered document, forcing him to sit across from her in a private office, without any of his usual administrative assistants or legal advisors to shield him. She did not raise her voice, nor did she engage in any theatrical displays of royal authority. She simply read the original, unedited notes of her grandnephew's testimony out loud, her voice cutting through the silent room like a scalpel. When she finished reading the deleted details, she closed the leather-bound folder with a sharp, definitive thud and looked directly at the trembling official, stating that the palace's habit of altering reality to preserve its own image had officially crossed the line into criminal negligence. The official had lowered his eyes, unable to meet the steady, unyielding gaze of the Princess Royal, his silence confirming their worst possible fears. This was not a simple case of a lazy bureaucrat making a typo or missing a file. A deliberate, coordinated effort had been made by senior elements within the royal household to hide the true nature of the threat from the Prince of Wales. The discovery changed the entire trajectory of the investigation, shifting it from a standard security review into an active internal hunt for a powerful, deeply embedded traitor, as the family realized the danger had been building for weeks before the alarm was ever raised. The official's downcast eyes and heavy silence inside that private office confirmed a terrifying shift in reality, marking the exact moment the investigation transformed from an external security review into a full-blown hunting expedition within the palace walls. The specific physical characteristics Prince Louis had described, the exact height, the tone of voice, and that highly unusual, out-of-season operational badge, matched another individual perfectly. This individual had been spotted weeks prior during a seemingly routine commemorative service at St. George's Chapel, and did not hesitate to compile these matching data points into a highly encrypted, secure digital briefing file, bypassing the standard palace server entirely to send it directly to William's personal device. When the Prince of Wales opened the file and saw the side-by-side comparison, the realization hit him like a physical blow. This wasn't a case of an obsessive fan making a lucky guess or a random trespasser wandering onto the estate by accident. This was a calculated return. This was a targeted stalking campaign conducted by someone who knew exactly how to blend into the background of royal life, and William was now fully prepared to dismantle any department necessary to uncover the face of the person who had authorized this individual's repeated entry. William entered the main administrative wing of the palace not with the measured, diplomatic stride of a statesman, but with the raw, volatile energy of a father whose patience had been completely incinerated. He bypassed the formal reception desks, ignoring the startled looks of junior secretaries and assistants who quickly scrambled out of his way as he marched straight toward the office of the senior household official responsible for temporary staff clearances, and followed just a step behind, her presence serving as a grim guarantee that no corporate excuses or polite delays would be tolerated. No aides were permitted to enter the room behind them, the heavy doors were locked from the inside, and no prepared public relations statements were available to soften the devastating confrontation that followed. William didn't wait for the official to stand up or offer a rehearsed apology. He slammed the encrypted briefing report down onto the desk, demanding an immediate, unvarnished explanation of how known security risk had been granted valid, high-level electronic credentials for a second time. The senior official, visibly pale and trembling under the combined glare of the future king and the Princess Royal, desperately tried to retreat behind the defensive language of corporate procedure. He stammered that the clearance process during major royal engagements was always an administrative nightmare, with hundreds of temporary support staff, catering crews, and technical contractors needing rapid validation to prevent embarrassing logistical delays. He argued that the suspect's credentials had appeared completely legitimate on paper, having passed through multiple preliminary vetting desks before landing on his desk for final electronic signature. He insisted that nothing in the digital file had raised an immediate red flag, and that under normal operating guidelines, the approval was considered entirely routine. But William completely rejected the polished narrative of a simple administrative oversight, his voice rising in pitch as he accused the official of prioritizing the smooth operation of a party over the basic physical safety of a young child. He pointed out that while the household was busy worrying about schedule efficiency and preventing minor delays, his 7-year-old son was waking up screaming in the middle of the night, terrified that every shadow in his bedroom belonged to the man from the corridor. The confrontation reached an even more critical level when Anne stepped forward, placing a secondary document, a printed copy of the original security log from the St. George's Chapel event, directly over the official's open ledger. She asked him to explain why Prince Louis's initial warning about the stranger with the private family nickname had been entirely omitted from the final threat assessment report used to clear temporary workers for the subsequent engagement. That threat assessment was supposed to be the definitive shield used by the protection teams to filter out potential risks, but without the child's crucial testimony, the suspect had appeared completely harmless to the automated vetting systems, and repeated the exact words the stranger had whispered to the young prince in the chapel corridor, her voice filled with a cold, mocking sarcasm as she asked if a direct promise to meet again was considered too minor to warrant a data entry. The official's face completely changed color, his jaw dropping slightly as the silence in the room exposed a level of institutional covering-up that went far beyond mere laziness or incompetence. Under the relentless, combined pressure of William's anger and Anne's systematic questioning, the senior official's administrative defense completely collapsed. He finally admitted, his voice barely above a whisper on the secure room's recording device, that the normal secondary background checks had been intentionally bypassed because a powerful office within the palace had personally requested that this specific contractor's clearance be expedited. This meant the intruder hadn't simply slipped through a weak spot in the technological perimeter. A deliberate, human hand possessing immense internal influence had actively pushed him through the security net. When N demanded to know exactly which department held enough authority to override standard counter-terrorism vetting protocols, the official hesitated, looking toward the door as if praying for an interruption. N leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper as she reminded him that his career was already finished, and his only choice now was whether he wanted to face an internal tribunal or a public criminal prosecution for conspiracy. The name that finally left the official's lips sent a fresh wave of tension through the room, identifying a highly trusted, deeply embedded department directly tied to the planning of high-profile royal appearances and public spectacles. This was an office that worked in constant, daily proximity to the senior members of the royal family, managing the intricate visual details and media distributions that shaped the monarchy's global image. It was a department that feared a public relations delay far more than it respected a security warning, viewing the strict protection protocols as a tedious administrative hurdle rather than a life-saving necessity. William immediately ordered a total, unredacted disclosure of every email, digital message, and phone log originating from that specific office over the previous 6 months, refusing to leave the room until the digital transfer was complete. Uncovering the administrative path that opened the door was a massive breakthrough, but it immediately triggered an even larger, more dangerous institutional battle over who possessed the ultimate authority to shut it down for good. The debate over how to handle the findings quickly escalated into a profound, philosophical crisis that reached the very top of the monarchy's command structure, exposing a deep and bitter rift between the traditionalists who managed the institution and the parents who raised the children. Senior courtiers from the old guard argued with frantic intensity that a public admission of an internal security breach, combined with the sudden, unexplained withdrawal of Prince Louis from major national events, would cause catastrophic damage to public confidence in the royal house. They feared that the international media would interpret the move as a sign of profound weakness, vulnerability, and internal chaos, potentially inviting further threats from anti-monarchy groups or unstable individuals. They urged William to consider a compromise, suggesting that Louis could make brief, highly controlled appearances on the Buckingham Palace balcony without participating in the more exposed processions, allowing the family to maintain a facade of total stability and control. But William completely refused to allow his youngest son to be used as a public relations prop or a shield to protect the administrative reputation of a failing household system. He made it completely clear to the advisory boards that his role as a protective father would always completely override his duties as the future king of the country, and that he would happily cancel every single scheduled public appearance for the next year before he allowed a traumatized child to be put on display for the cameras. And stood firmly beside him during these tense late-night debates, her decades of experience giving her the leverage needed to challenge the old guard without being dismissed as overly emotional or reactionary. She reminded the traditionalists that the true strength of the crown survived through discipline and genuine integrity, not by forcing a terrified, anxious child to perform a scripted smile for the public while the adults behind him scrambled to hide their own professional failures. The internal deadlock was finally broken when King Charles III intervened, recognizing that the conflict had created a dangerous constitutional standstill that no existing protocol or precedent could quietly resolve. The king sat with William, Catherine, and Anne in a private sitting room, listening in complete silence as his daughter presented the irrefutable evidence of the expedited clearance and the deliberate omission of Louis's initial warning. Catherine did not soften her words when addressing the monarch, stating plainly that she would gladly accept the criticism of every tabloid newspaper in the world before she asked her son to ignore his genuine fear for the sake of royal continuity. She argued that an appearance of stability built on the suffering of a child was a hollow, disgusting lie that the modern public would immediately see through anyway. Charles looked at the detailed internal summary, reading the timeline of the administrative failures twice before setting the papers down on his lap with a heavy, profound sigh. He looked at the exhausted, determined faces of his son and daughter-in-law, and when he softly asked how long his youngest grandson had been forced to carry this secret terror alone, the answer left the monarch completely unable to speak. The king's emotional reaction signaled the total collapse of any lingering palace resistance to William's demands, clearing the way for an unprecedented wave of administrative purges and systemic restructuring that began at dawn. By the following morning, the palace's internal networks were in a state of absolute chaos as names were systematically wiped from official duty rosters, security clearances were summarily revoked, and major public appearances that had been meticulously planned for months were abruptly cancelled. Yet, despite the technical necessity of these protective measures, the immediate visual consequence of the decision was deeply painful for the family to witness within their own home. Catherine saw the stark reality of the crisis first when she received a revised copy of the upcoming ceremonial layout, staring at the empty, white space on the chart where her youngest son's name had been proudly positioned just days before. William felt the same sharp sting of loss later that afternoon when a miniature, custom-tailored ceremonial uniform was quietly wheeled out of the residence and returned to the dark depths of the palace storage vaults, a silent monument to a childhood that had been abruptly altered by fear. Charles acted with absolute, unyielding authority before the suspended officials could attempt to mobilize any legal or administrative defense through their professional unions. The king signed an executive decree authorizing the immediate, indefinite suspension of every single planning director and security coordinator connected to the bypassed vetting process, effectively shutting down the compromised ceremonial office. This team had once held immense, unquestioned power over the daily lives and public schedules of the entire royal family, operating as an elite entity that answered only to historical tradition. Now, their entire operation stood exposed as a negligent, image-obsessed bureaucracy that had actively placed a young child in direct physical danger to avoid a scheduling delay. William, however, refused to be satisfied with mere suspensions, ordering a comprehensive, independent forensic review of every single individual who had been granted temporary access to George, Charlotte, and Louis over the previous 6 months. He demanded a complete digital trail of names, dates, approvals, and a detailed list of every single junior safety objection that had been ignored by the directors, proving that he no longer trusted the polished executive summaries provided by his own household staff. The administrative purge sent shockwaves through the corridors of the estate, but inside the private rooms of Adelaide Cottage, the victory felt incredibly heavy. Catherine received the final confirmation of the changes in a private digital memo, her eyes lingering on the official notice that Louis had been completely removed from a forthcoming national anniversary event. It was a celebration the young prince had talked about for months, eagerly practicing a salute and asking his older brother George if they would be allowed to ride in the lead carriage together. The princess understood that this total withdrawal was the only logical way to guarantee his physical and psychological safety, yet seeing the cold administrative confirmation still felt like a cruel robbery of his innocence. She walked down the hallway to the children's wardrobe room, finding the small ceremonial outfit hanging separately from the larger uniforms prepared for George and Charlotte. She reached out, her fingers brushing against the crisp fabric of the sleeve before she closed the heavy wooden doors to hide the sight, only to turn around and find Louis standing quietly at the entrance. The young prince looked up at his mother, his small voice breaking through the elaborate explanations she had spent hours rehearsing with William. He didn't ask about the security protocols, the suspended officials, or the encrypted data logs. He simply asked if the family was leaving for the big parade without him because he had done something wrong. The raw vulnerability of the question shattered Catherine's composure, forcing her to blink back tears as she rushed forward to scoop her son into her arms, holding him tightly against her shoulder while promising him over and over that he was the bravest boy in the country. The emotional fallout quickly spread through the sibling dynamic as well, creating a somber environment that the older children struggled to comprehend. Charlotte became visibly upset during a rehearsal briefing later that afternoon, demanding to know why her younger brother was being left behind and why the strange person who had frightened him in the corridor still possessed the invisible power to change how their entire family lived their lives. George, always the most observant and serious of the three, reacted with a quiet, protective maturity, pulling William aside in the library to ask if appearing on the balcony without Louis might make his little brother feel completely abandoned by the people he loved most. The family's collective despair was compounded by a secondary investigative briefing delivered to Princess and by a specialist counter-stalking unit. The newly uncovered digital trail revealed that the suspect had not merely chanced upon Louis by accident during those two specific events. The individual had actively sought administrative clearance for 3 separate, high-profile royal gatherings over the past 6 months, specifically targeting events where the whale's children were scheduled to appear. It was a chilling revelation that pointed to a sustained, deeply calculated pattern of fixation that had been completely missed by the palace's automated vetting systems, because each application had been reviewed by a different junior desk as an isolated incident. Even more disturbing was the discovery that a junior protection officer had actually flag-marked the suspect's second application due to a minor discrepancy in his employment history, but that valid security objection had been summarily overruled by a senior director in the ceremonial planning office who wanted to avoid a staffing shortage during a busy weekend. Anne's voice hardened as she ordered the investigation team to trace that specific digital signature back to its source, declaring that whoever had the authority to erase a child's protection log would face the absolute full weight of the law. The dark clouds hanging over the household didn't begin to clear until Louis himself made a completely unexpected request that transformed the entire meaning of the family's defensive strategy. The senior advisors, the intelligence chiefs, and the royal physicians had all assumed that the final decision had been made, believing that the young prince would need to be shielded from the public eye for at least a year to fully recover from the psychological trauma of the breach. But late that evening, after the frantic bustle of administrative meetings had finally subsided, Louis sat alone with William in the quiet sanctuary of the family's private study. The father had expected his son to ask more questions about the intruder or express fear about the upcoming events, but instead, the little prince looked at the small, colorful event badge that had been left on the side table, the official pass he was supposed to wear during the parade. He looked up at William and admitted that he still wanted to be brave like his older brother and sister, and that he didn't want to disappear completely into the dark just because a stranger had used a scary voice. Louis explained to his father, with a heartbreaking sincerity, that while he was still terrified of unfamiliar footsteps outside his door and hated entering large rooms where the security hadn't been verified, he didn't want to live in hiding forever. He made a specific, highly unusual request. He asked if he could skip the giant, noisy public parades and the overwhelming balcony appearances where thousands of cameras were pointed at his face, but still be allowed to attend the small family gatherings, the private chapel services, and the quiet weekend outings with the people he trusted completely. The young prince was drawing his own boundary, refusing to let the terror of the security breach define the entirety of his childhood, while simultaneously rejecting the high-pressure spectacle that the old guard had always insisted was mandatory for a royal child. William listened to his son's words with a profound sense of pride, realizing that this 7-year-old Bacha had shown more genuine courage and clarity than all the high-ranking courtiers and administrative directors who managed the palace machinery combined. William knelt down beside his son's chair, picking up the small event badge from the table and placing it gently into Louis's hand, telling him that true bravery did not mean pretending to be fearless for the sake of a television broadcast. He promised his youngest son that from that moment forward, no official, no tradition, and no level of public expectation would ever be allowed to dictate when or where he appeared, and that Louis himself would hold the ultimate veto over his own schedule. This private agreement became the foundation for a radical new philosophy within the household, a principle that and later codified as a total shift from mandatory royal performance to absolute child consent. The Princess Royal took the details of William's promise and began crafting a highly strategic, unyielding public communication plan that would present the family's decision to the world not as a retreat or a sign of vulnerability, but as a unified, powerful stance against institutional pressure. When the official announcement finally flashed across the international news networks, interrupting regularly scheduled programming with a dramatic headline regarding Louis's withdrawal, the public reaction completely vindicated the family's uncompromising approach. The old guard courtiers had spent weeks panicking behind closed doors, convinced that the public would view the sudden change as a weakness or a failure of the monarchy's security apparatus, potentially damaging the institution's global standing. Instead, the dominant emotion that swept across the country was an overwhelming wave of fierce, parental protection toward the young prince. Parents, child safety advocates, and regular citizens flooded social media and news commentary columns with absolute support for William and Catherine's decision, praising them for prioritizing their child's mental health and emotional recovery over the rigid, archaic demands of royal ceremonial tradition. The country wasn't demanding that the young royal return to show off a scripted smile for the cameras. The public was angrily demanding a total investigation into how a child had ever been put in a position of vulnerability within a supposedly secure estate. Outside the main gates of Windsor Castle, the public response manifested in a beautiful, spontaneous display of solidarity that watched by the family from their windows. Families began arriving from all over the region, leaving handwritten cards, colorful drawings, and small toys beside the historic stone walls, creating a vibrant memorial to a childhood that the public was determined to protect. One national broadcaster paused its coverage over a picture drawn by a young girl showing the three royal siblings holding hands beneath a bold, handwritten message that told Louis to return only when he felt completely safe. And watched the broadcast in total silence from her private quarters, her sharp eyes softening as she realized the public possessed a far deeper understanding of basic human decency than the image-obsessed bureaucrats who had tried to hide the breach to protect a schedule. She immediately called William on a secure line, telling him that the country had officially broken the power of the palace traditionalists, and the prince admitted it was the very first time he had felt a genuine sense of relief since the crisis began. The overwhelming wave of public sympathy provided King Charles with the definitive leverage he needed to permanently rewrite the constitutional rules governing the protection of the monarchy's youngest members. The king signed an extensive, legally binding child protection protocol that completely dismantled the old system of temporary security clearances, replacing it with a rigorous, independent vetting matrix managed directly by senior counterterrorism commanders rather than event planners. From that day forward, every single individual seeking proximity to a royal child would face repeated identity verification, biometric tracking, and an absolute zero-tolerance policy for any expedited approvals, and ensured that total administrative accountability was enforced, delivering a finalized internal summary confirming that every single director who had authorized a shortcut or minimized Louis's initial warning had been permanently stripped of their titles and removed from public service. The family finally found the peace they had been fighting for, culminating in a quiet, unannounced walk toward a small private chapel service on the estate grounds. Louis walked between his parents, his small fingers securely wrapped around William's hand, taking his first confident steps back into the world without a single camera lens in sight, proving that the crown had finally chosen to carry the burden of a child rather than forcing a child to carry the weight of the crown. And that is the absolute, unvarnished reality behind the Golden Gates, a family completely redefining what it means to wear the crown, proving that a father's love and a child's right to feel safe will always triumph over centuries of rigid, image-obsessed tradition. The era of forcing a frightened child to perform for the global stage is officially over, and the palace has finally been corrected by the sheer force of truth. But now, the real question belongs to you. Do you think Prince William and Princess Anne did the right thing by completely dismantling the palace hierarchy to protect Prince Louis? Or do you believe the old guard was right, and that withdrawing a young prince from the public eye sends a dangerous signal of weakness to the rest of the world? How do you think this massive administrative shakeup will permanently change the future of the British monarchy for George and Charlotte? We want to hear your absolute thoughts on this. So drop your perspective in the comments section below, and let's start a massive conversation. If you believe that a child's safety should always come before the demands of the state, make sure to hit that like button right now. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on all notifications so you never miss another deep, investigative dive into the hidden truths behind the world's most powerful institutions. Thank you for watching, and we will see you in the very next expose.